All right, so before we begin, I would just like to state for the record that today is June 2nd, 2021, and my name is Ben Bauman, and I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm speaking via phone with Graham Richard, who is it San Francisco, California?
Correct.
Okay, great. And we are doing an interview for the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative. So just to start off, when and where were you born?
I was born in Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, Ohio, and I was born January 1st, 1947, and a little community kind of history on that. My father was a sales representative for a gasoline pump manufacturing company that was founded in Fort Wayne, Indiana, called Tokine. My mother had grown up in Ohio, and they met in Worcester, Ohio, where my mother was attending school, and got married. And so I was really a resident and a Buckeye by only about a year before my father moved back to Fort Wayne.
Sure. Okay. And it sounds like you had a birthday yesterday then?
No, I meant to say, if I didn't say it clearly, January 1st.
January 1st. Got it. Okay. I thought you said June for a second. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. And where was your family from before Indiana and Ohio?
Well, my family on the Richard side traces the lineage back to Alsace-Lorraine. Mm-hmm. And the name Richard became Richard when the French controlled that disputed country. Mm. And when the Germans, it was Richard.
Okay.
So I have both German and French background, but the history of my father's family was almost 6 generations in Fort Wayne, Indiana, starting with farming and then merchants and dry goods, and then my mother's family, the Stillings family, is all from Ohio.
Okay.
Around Gahanna, Ohio, and Gambier, and near the Columbus area, lots of Woody Hayes fans and big Ohio State commitments. So that my mother's from different parts of Ohio, and my father's family going back many generations, Fort Wayne.
Okay, interesting. And what were your parents' names?
My father's name is Arthur C. Richard, and he was a junior. So he was Arthur Clyde Richard. And my mother's family name is Stillings, and she was Anne Stillings Richard. Okay.
Did you have any siblings growing up?
I had 4 sisters. I'm the only boy, and I was the second oldest of a family of 5 children.
Got it. Okay. And how would you describe your childhood growing up?
I would describe it as a 50s era, very active in the neighborhood, and playing basketball and tennis, and very active in extracurricular activities at school. It was a period of time where you had lots of different avenues for pursuing things you like to pursue. I was very active as a church member at Trinity Episcopal Church. I was a Boy Scout. I believe I might have set a record as the youngest Eagle Scout in the community at the time. And
wow.
Scout God and Country Award winner. And in high school, I was the president of the student body at a time when the baby boomers were just pushing the enrollments in Northside High School through the roof, quite literally. We had a high school that was built for probably 800, and at one point we had 2,600 students in 3 shifts. So I was part of that, graduating in 1965, part of that whole wave of school corporations not having planned to build enough schools to handle the post-war baby boomer population.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Who would you say was the most influential person in your childhood?
I hesitate with that because my father was not very present because of his constant work schedule and volunteer work. Probably most influential was my mother, but I had a lot of opportunities. And a person that I particularly single out was my Jack Root, who was my Boy Scout troop leader, and he owned a camping store.
Okay.
And I really enjoyed spending time there. And then he took us on canoeing trips up into Michigan onto whitewater. So we would do that 4 or 5 times a year. So I became, he was very much a coach and a mentor to me. I had a couple of really key teachers that were influential, particularly in high school. And the individual who was the assistant to the rector of Trinity Episcopal Church, a gentleman by the name of, we called him Father Bradley McCormick. And then I would say some contemporaries were very influential, who are continued to be friends today, who were maybe slightly older than I was, but I worked with them in some capacity. An example of that would be when I was a Boy Scout camp junior leader trainer at Camp Big Island in 1965 before going off to college. Bill Smith was also a camp counselor and has been a friend and lifelong friend through thick and thin. So those are some of the individuals. My uncle was a member of the county council and at one point head of the county park commission. My father was on the city plan commission. So at an early age, I went to some of those meetings and got enthusiastic about government, politics, read a lot of books on political leaders, and made the decision at that time that I was interested in public policy and elections and government.
Sure. Yeah, so what understanding did you have about your family's political views?
Well, at that time, I wasn't that engaged. They were very strong Republicans.
Okay.
I remember, listening and debating, and the election in 1964, I was in high school, and a lot of people were supporting Barry Goldwater. I was probably nominally a Republican. Mm-hmm. And that election back to the Kennedy election in 60, so I was old enough to understand the partisanship and the difference between the two candidates and follow it, and read a lot of books about the more history of political figures, but found that to be I was always a very active reader, still am, mm-hmm. Consuming lots of books, and I enjoy historical biographies in particular.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. And growing up, what schools did you attend?
Well, we were in that period of time where there was in Indiana been a school consolidation movement going on, and the township system was still the strong system. So I lived within the city of Fort Wayne in St. Joseph Township, which meant that at one point I was attending a much closer kindergarten at a local school, but then nearby, walkable. But then the township authority prevailed, and I had to be yelled school bused for a number of years, I think at least 4, to St. Joe Central School. And eventually then the Fort Wayne Community Schools did some annexation of territory, and then I walked for the 5th and the 6th grade to Francis Slocum, which is less than a half a mile from my residence. And then I attended Lakeside. Again, I would walk back and forth. That was close to a mile. And then Northside High School, which is where my father had gone to high school. And all of those were within a mile and a half, but at that time of life, bicycles weren't that popular. You walked. You walked. Even if you run track or cross country or you were pretty darn tired after an intense tennis match, you still walked home with your book bag. So it was a great experience to be able to have neighborhood-based schools where I knew the neighborhood and knew the students and felt very safe and very much a part of a community.
Sure. Okay. And so how would you describe your educational experiences overall growing up?
Well, let's separate them from sort of pre-college and then college.
Right, yeah.
So growing up, there was a great deal of support in our public school system for learning, for arts, for lots of extracurricular activities. Looking back, it was a relatively segregated, I would say significantly segregated environment. And as an adult, there was a magnet school program to help desegregate the schools.
Okay.
So I did not have much of a diversity of experience, but I did have the good fortune to have leadership roles as a class president or student body president and lots of extracurricular activities. So every day after school and weekends, I was involved in speech and tennis and at one point cross country and student government and civic engagement across the community. I helped to start a number of organizations. As a high school student in particular, a citywide youth council and an opportunity for campaigning to help build a children's zoo. And so there was a lot of activity with church, with school, with scouts. Maybe not quite like we have characterized it today with the helicopter parents who are taking their kids to all the different events. But
right.
There was still an awful lot of activity that was really fun and meaningful. And in the neighborhood, this was prior to the advent of a lot of interest in soccer, and there weren't very many sports for girls. But the basketball pickup games, the whole Hoosier hysteria. I mean, even today, if I were a little bit better shape, and up until like 4 years ago I would play basketball.
Yeah.
It was just part of the rhythm of my youth.
Sure, yeah. And so in school, what was your favorite subject?
Well, it was a cross between history and what we would call now social science.
Okay.
And English. I loved particularly literature, reading, Shakespeare plays. So I've always those two would be my favorite.
Yeah. Okay. And what were your views about the state of Indiana or being a Hoosier as a child?
Well, I think it was protected, sheltered, and not until I got into college did I perceive the bias, the racism, the sexism, a lot of people would say that's conventional old family values. And like many things, there are separations of, strands of truth and strands of unwillingness to recognize.
Yeah.
Later I learned that, as you know, Ben, that Indiana has a very interesting history. It was a state that at one time had more labor unions and some of the most forceful labor movement leaders in the United States. And it also had a very active Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Up in through the 20s. So we're a state where you could have the John Birch founded, and you could have the Working Party of Socialists founded.
Yeah.
And those strands were evident in our political leadership as well, from moderates to liberals to very, very conservative leaders. So I sensed some of that, but it was when I went away to college and began to read and study and see other parts of the world that I learned in my own hometown of Fort Wayne that there were places where lots of low-income folks who were black were, in a sense, redlined to live.
Right.
And so that began a whole new exploration of my own community every summer as I came back from my studying at Princeton University.
Sure.
In the summer, starting the summer of '66 through the summer of '69. And during that terribly turbulent period, my worldview changed drastically, and I found, and we helped to create a series of community first volunteer service organizations, and then some efforts to work with black and white college-age students to tackle the challenges in our own city and become much more concerned about race relations, discrimination. We started the Care Again Summer Action Program and a youth building program. That fundamentally altered my view of my own community by finding great talent, great resources, and tremendous challenges that I just had not recognized, prior to my turning roughly the age of 18, 19.
Yeah. Okay. Now, at Princeton, what was your major?
Well, they have a system, and it's one of the reasons I was delighted to be admitted to Princeton. That was back when Princeton was an all-male college,
Mm-hmm.
and very much in the F. Scott Fitzgerald kind of great, the image of Princeton.
Right.
And I was, prior to my years there, the vast majority of the men came from private schools of privilege.
Yeah.
And I was a public school student. I struggled in my first year because I was a bright, high IQ person who did a lot of extracurricular stuff in Fort Wayne, and quite candidly wasn't as diligent as I should have been in some of my subjects. Because when I got there, I got into, unfortunately, academic probation in my first semester.
Okay.
And got some bad advice on I took all the hardest courses.
Okay.
Rather than sprinkling some, and
Yeah.
kind of thought I could handle, advanced calculus and trigonometry and philosophy and just a lot of tough courses. And French, I had no language arts background except for Latin. Anyway, long story short, I was able to have much better performance after that first semester. So I was able to compete and be admitted to what at that time was called the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs.
Oh, okay.
The name has since been changed to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs due to the less than stellar history of Woodrow Wilson in terms of race relations. So the university voted recently to remove his name from that.
Right.
Even though he'd been the president of Princeton University and had been the governor of New Jersey and the president of the United States. So back to the point you were raising, I was able to structure, and why I liked that program was you could take policy courses in the School of Public and International Affairs, but you could create at that time through courses in all other different departments, politics, history. I particularly enjoyed a sociology course that changed my worldview of thinking about the sociology of the future by the first tenured woman professor, Suzanne Keller, at Princeton. And so that allowed me to create then an urban affairs sub-major, you will say, I guess,
okay.
the way you look at it. And then I could take courses from all these different departments.
Yeah.
So urban design, School of Architecture, the sociology of the city. I did internships in Trenton during the height of some of the worst civil unrest in that community, and same thing in Newark and in Harlem. I had the opportunity to learn both in the field and in the classroom.
Yeah.
And it served me very well for all of my life to be a systems thinker. And I took a course modeled on a course that Ralph Nader had done on, each of the courses had a policy workshop in it, and you had to take a problem. Should the United States Surgeon General provide a warning on the cancer-causing detrimental health effects of smoking? So we would take a particular problem statement, and we learned a fast action way of researching and how to do policy research, which had served me in all my business and public life, because that's the method by which I try to tackle a challenge and come up with the best solutions. So that was very, very formative, and it came through. You asked me what my major was. That learning experience came through the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, because it was the only school at that time. That was before the Kennedy School had been established. There were a few others. I think there was one at maybe Johns Hopkins and one at Georgetown and one at Tufts. But most schools didn't have what Indiana University has now, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Those were not typical at all. And so Princeton had one of the few.
Yeah, okay. And so what did you hope to do with your education once you graduated from Princeton?
Well, I came back and I was awaiting the outcome of a lottery draft. I chose not to either go into ROTC or enlist. I was opposed to the Vietnam War, but not to the point where I was, going to protest sufficiently to move to Canada. So I ended up deciding, at the request of a friend, to teach American literature at Bishop Dwenger High School. At the same time, I had taken the LSATs and been admitted to law school. My father, as I mentioned, was a very strong Republican.
Yeah.
My mother probably was a independent but voted Republican. And as I finished up my 1969 spring of 70 teaching, the local Democratic county chairman, because I'd been active in the Bobby Kennedy campaign, called me and said, "Do you want to run for the state legislature as a Democrat?"
Mm-hmm.
And I told that to my father, who said things that were, what should I say, unpleasant.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got long hair, you came back, you didn't go to law school, I paid for Princeton, and what do I get? I get a goddamn Republican. I can't believe it. I mean, I get a Democrat instead of a Republican. What are you doing? This is such an embarrassment. Your uncle will never forgive us. And I was residing at home because I'd been teaching, and I think I made $6,000 or $5,000 teaching that year.
Yeah.
And so he was really upset.
Yeah.
And so I went to talk to the Republican county chairman, Orvis Beers, and he basically said, you're a nice guy, but you're way too young, 23, no way, you just go to law school, get settled, come back, run for the city council, do something local, but the state legislature, nah, you don't do that. Well, I chose to run as a Democrat, and there were 5 at-large candidates on the Democratic side and 5 on the Republican side. And in the September, in the election day in November, I was declared, along with an upset of the Republican congressman, a Democrat by the name of J. Edwin Roush, won congressional, and there's a big rally at the Coliseum, and I was introduced as the only Democrat at age 23 to be announced the winner by like 400 votes.
Wow.
And then by Friday, the Democratic chairman, Ivan Lebomov, called me and said, "Are you sitting down because the final absentee votes and all of them have been counted in? You've lost by about 2 votes a precinct. And you can have a recount, but you have to pay a certain dollar amount for every precinct, and the county had a lot of precincts, and I had no money.
Yeah.
And, I didn't have anybody that was willing to pay it. So I lost that election. And then that led me on the path to getting more involved with the state legislature. So that's an interesting entry point, because one of the people who called me just after Election Day, congratulating me on the amazing and outstanding win to have a Democrat elected from Fort Wayne, and his name was Richard Bodine.
Okay.
Dick Bodine, who had been the Speaker of the House, ran for governor. He was back in working to become the minority leader and work his way, back up into the hierarchy of state politics. He was from Mishawaka, and I became a good friend of Dick's, and he asked me to come and consider taking a job working as a legislative assistant. But then he said, but we really don't have any allocated places, but there's a doorkeeper position. And I'm going to take the doorkeepers that I'm assigned by Doris Dorbecker, who at that time was the chair of the Republican-led Committee on Administration of the House, in a sense. I'm not sure I have the title right, but so he hired, a Princeton-educated and I think a Harvard-educated and a bunch of really bright people to be doorkeepers. And there's a fun twist to this story. So we would obviously do research for the members of the caucus. We would look at bills that have been filed, write staff-based in addition to the legislative council. And one day, I don't know whether it was me or one of the others, but Representative Dorbecker came out and saw that we weren't just opening and closing the doors, that we would be reading things, and we create a little desk area, and we would be writing up memos. And she went in and literally screamed at Bodine and said, "Those aren't doorkeepers," because all the people she hired were like, octogenarians.
Yeah.
With a great smile and a stoop, and had been loyal Republican Party leaders. And we were, in our 20s and standing erect and giving people smiles and firm handshakes and researching. And she screamed at him and said, "Those aren't doorkeepers. Those are damned researchers. You tricked me, Dick Bodine. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make them be at the door all hours of the day." And so that was her vindictive move.
Yeah.
And like so many things in politics, watch out for what you're looking for and watch out for what you do. So that's what we did. We would stand there, we would use the doors, but we could continue to listen, learn, talk, and sneak in some research.
Yeah.
And so later on, when I got elected to the state senate, 2 elections later, in 1974, and I had like a freshman member, I had a cubicle way up inside the Senate chambers. And even though the Democrats had won quite a few seats, we didn't get control. So Phil Goodman was still the president pro tem, who was from Fort Wayne. So I'm this new young Democrat, 1974, barely old enough to be qualified, over the age of 25. And senators and particularly lobbyists would come in, and they would sit, come in, they'd say, well, I'm here on behalf of, and then name their lobbying organizations. And I would have such a detailed knowledge of their legislation, their bills, who they worked for. And some of them I could see them visibly leaving and scratching their heads. And how did he know all this? This is like this guy has been here for 20 years. And I never told some of them that, I'm just there at the door, and I'm just listening. And people were having all these conversations within my earsight, my eyesight, my hearing, and I filed it all away. And, so little did Doris know that she was actually creating a far knowledgeable, potential legislator by what she made us do as doorkeepers in that first session. So there's a little fun story for you.
That is pretty wild, yeah. So that ended up, helping your development quite a bit. So a few things. As you initially became involved in politics, what were the key issues or legislation that you wanted to work on?
Well, it was a little different in 1970 in the campaign when there were 5 at-large, and it was a whole, county-wide election, 92,000 voters, as I recall, versus when it was a 3-member district, when I ran in 72 and lost with Steve Franke and Roger Singleton. Roger Singleton had been the sheriff of Adams County, and he was an incumbent. And then that year, there was a landslide effect, even though we ran very, very far ahead of the ticket of the McGovern national presidential loss. And then, so the issues were different in each of those, but education and creating jobs, retaining jobs, those were issues that were a part of it. I brought in some of the issues around the environment. I'm always very interested in the environmental movement, which was gathering steam with Earth Day and with the Nixon legislation to create the Environmental Protection Agency, and Bill Wackelhaus being a Hoosier native that helped lead that agency in its early days. So that was of interest to me. And the other thing that I was always interested in, and sometimes you campaigned on it, and sometimes you didn't, because it was you campaign in poetry and govern in prose, is the old adage. So you'd listen to what it was that people were concerned about, but improvement of government, making government work better, has been a mantra of mine forever. So education, the environment, economic development, and how you make government work better. And that will come to be a part of what I hoped. When you asked me the question, what did I do as a 4-year state senator, that I look back on with pride, I can cite a few things in the making government work better that are still effective today. So those are the issues that I care about.
Sure. And when you were running your campaign that eventually got you elected, did you have a particular campaign strategy?
Well, the number one strategy was don't run in a multi-member district. If at all possible, run in a single-member district because of the dilution of your votes across particularly a county and a community that was very Republican. So it was hard as a Democrat to run and win in a multi-member district.
Okay.
So that's number one. Number two, I had learned in the campaigns in 70, and then I helped manage a campaign for mayor in 1971 for Ivan Lubinoff, and I learned from a wonderful mentor by the name of Matt Reese, who was instrumental in West Virginia of putting together a system that now is very commonplace. But it helped John F. Kennedy in 1960 in the primary win in West Virginia, which was not expected because of the nature of that of an anti-Catholicism kind of. But anyway, Matt Reese formed a firm, which the Democratic Party hired in 70 and 72 and 71. So I took those lessons and used that in a single-member district. And it was basically what today we would call deep one-on-one politics. I mean, he had a whole system. You had neighborhood walks, you had go-dees, you had coffee days, you had door-knocking days, your idea was to get 7 to 10 personal contacts with every voter in your state Senate district. And you targeted those voters based upon independent voters and what we called the swing voter. So it was an early use of what today is all done, by a combination of social media and door-to-door and direct mail. So we early on used those techniques. So number one, choose to run in a single-member district. Turned out that there was a non-incumbent in that state Senate district, so that's also an advantage that I used when I ran for mayor as well. Incumbents, whether they're members of Congress, state senators, are hard to beat unless you have an overwhelming advantage, like money, like a controversy or an indictment of the incumbent or something. So that's what I learned, and that was my strategy, and then I talked about the issues that people cared about.
Yeah, okay. And do you remember your main opponent?
Interesting, I do quite well, because ironically, he had actually made a contribution to a previous campaign of mine, and we were neighbors, and our families knew each other. His name was Phil Olofsson, and Phil was a prominent local Republican who owned a media public relations firm, and was very well known. There were three things in that campaign that were events that happened. I don't want to call them good fortune, because one of them was not good fortune. So Phil's wife got cancer, and he was less effective as a candidate than he might have been, obviously because of that. The other thing that happened, which was, the Watergate debacle and Nixon's resigning from office. So in 74, there were a lot of independents and Republicans that were willing to vote for a young Democrat.
Interesting. Okay.
And the third was some of the local and national economic trends were hurting the Republicans. And so all three of those things, plus, regardless of Phil's wife's illness, his campaign was lackluster.
Yeah.
And he did not do the door-to-door and all the grassroots. And by the time I'd run 3 times, we had a very strong base of young volunteers. So we had a lot of vigor and vitality.
Yeah.
And I think, that people knew that, hey, this is his third time out, He must really want to become a state legislator, and, let's give him a chance.
Yeah. Okay. So how did your first election day feel like?
Well, it was a very eventful time because my wife Beverly was also pregnant.
Oh, okay.
And so my daughter, Heather, was born December 28th, 1974. So it was a suspenseful, eventful, and really I was delighted.
Yeah.
I was looking forward to, and I kind of knew the State House well because between jobs, I also worked for the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, John Laughlin. And I did that after I was the doorkeeper / researcher in the 1971 legislative session.
Yeah.
So I knew the State House. I was very comfortable having worked there and had lots of friends, staff people, office holders. So I was excited about the opportunity to get down there and get going.
Sure.
And another startup opportunity. I love starting up things, businesses. That's another part of my life that I've always engaged in. So, an example, during the time that I was doing my preparation to run in 72 and run in 74 eventually, I started my own company, and I helped to start a cable TV company, a public television station, and I just did, kind of advisory consulting work, which I've done all my life in different forms. We can talk about that later. But
yeah.
So I was excited about. I knew some of the legislation I wanted to be involved in. I already, kind of came in with that experience as being kind of in an internship mode, if you will. And I'll tell you another quick anecdote, kind of funny story. I got laryngitis and got ill, with the campaign, the birth of my daughter, trying to get situated in Indianapolis, find a place, all that stuff. So I ended up being okay, but I lost my voice. I had a really bad case of laryngitis. So, like newer members, I had a seat on the very last row of the chamber. And because there weren't enough seats by seniority on the side of the chamber that had the Democrats seated, I was seated on the Republican side. And we had some votes that were taken in that first day. And prior to taking those votes, Senator, he probably will never remember this, and I'm not sure if he's even alive with us today. He's probably passed on. But there was a former educator by the name of King Telle, Telle.
Okay.
And he was a Republican and tall, slender, bespectacled, a gentleman. Really, So on the first day that we were there, before we did any votes or anything, he called me over and he said, "Say, I'd like you don't mind, to have you pick up those bills that I've got waiting at the bill room and down at Legislative Council. And when you come back, I've got something else I'd like you to do." And I said, "Senator, I'm happy to do that. And I'm going that way." So I go, I get the bills and bring it back and so forth. And he thanks me, and I think he wanted a glass of water or something. So I was getting some water, so I brought some water. And so we're sitting down, and we're starting to do our routine roll call and our votes. And I'm, putting the green or the red button on, whatever. And he keeps looking over at me. And then he pulls out this booklet that has all of us, they published it. It has your picture and a little bit about your background. And I don't know if they still publish it, but it's the members of the Senate and the members of the House and where your district is, and just a little, and it's got your picture. And I see him opening that and looking at it, and then his face drops, and then he comes over and he says, "Senator Richard, I have an apology to make to you. I thought you were an intern. I thought you were one of the new interns working for us on the Senate side. And that's why I asked you to go do that." And I said, "No offense taken. I'm sure there'll be a time that you can repay me."
Wow.
And that happened. That happened. There was a piece of legislation, non-controversial, that came up. I don't know whether it was to refer to a committee or whatever, but something not. And he went up and he said, "I rise for a point of personal privilege. My good senator friend from Fort Wayne, Graham Richard, has laryngitis. And he's not asking me to do this. But I'm standing up here to repay a little favor to him. And I'm here to continue to second and support this amendment." And then he sat down.
Wow.
So, one of the observations I would have about the Senate in 1970, well, we started in 74, but 75, 76, through to 78, is that you could co-sponsor a major piece of legislation with John Muntz, for example, Republican, who ultimately became lieutenant governor.
Yeah.
And you could work across the aisle, and you could even have a disagreement, debates, whatever. And then you could go out and, as I did, play tennis. State Senator Mike Gary and I would play tennis with Lieutenant Governor Bob Orr or John Muntz, or there was a long-standing table tennis in the basement of one of the Indianapolis Republicans, and Democrats and Republicans alike would go over it.
Yeah.
It was a time where, you had these disagreements, but you weren't disagreeable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah, a few things, I guess, to piggyback off that. Obviously, the political tension today has certainly been well known for a lot of people. So, how do you think politics has changed in Indiana based on what you just said?
I think there's a very specific change that happened. It's sort of like the old adage, you went bankrupt very, very slowly, and then all of a sudden, very suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
I think this insensitivity, this arch partisan, this gotcha, this enemy compat, the more blood you can draw, the more your side is pleased that you did it, even if it's not true that you drew blood by false accusations. So there's three things. One, when I ran for the state legislature, I think my campaign in 1974, we might have raised about 16,000, as I recall. And maybe 1,000 of that came from those people in leadership in the Senate who wanted to be the pro tem or the majority leader. And you raised your own money, and you had your own fundraisers, and those people who wanted to influence you in some way may have given you campaign contributions. That started to change when the speaker and the pro tem, the minority leader in each house, started to raise massive amounts of money, millions of dollars, and then turn around and disperse that money to the favored candidates in their party for winning.
Yeah.
And more of the money came through legislative interest groups giving more and more money to the leadership. And you became, as a candidate, dependent upon your parties. Now, 10,000, 20, 50, 100, 150,000. That gave the Speaker, the President Pro Tem, the Minority Leader, in both houses, massive power.
Yeah.
And it, in a sense, changed with a small d, the democratization of campaign finance and funding. Because they also would do things like, hey, we're going to buy a poll, to take a poll in your district. And we're buying it from a polling firm that's going to do polls in 50 legislative districts, and we're going to pay for it. But we may not share all the crosstabs with you. We'll interpret what it says for you in your district.
Yeah.
Okay, so all of a sudden, you as a candidate don't have the transparency and oh, by the way, we're going to do direct mail. We got our direct mail firm, and they're going to do direct mail for all 100 districts or whichever districts some of them they would write off as worthless. And so maybe they're going to choose 60 for democracy. Well, now that's being produced, mailed, sent out by your caucus and the Indiana State Democratic Party. So what does that do? It makes it harder for you to ever go against your caucus.
Yeah.
If the leadership says, we want you to vote on this Equal Rights Amendment, on this abortion bill, on this, all the controversial bills that we see in the legislature. And they then, there used to be a process where we would vote to have a caucus bind, which means you're expected to vote the way the majority of the caucus wants to. Now, I'm not in those caucuses, but I've been told that it's so perfunctory that if the leadership says this is a caucus bind, they don't even really take a vote because they know they're going to get a majority that's going to say, yeah, we all agree, because they're dependent upon what the leadership wants for them to be able to keep a primary opponent out of their campaign, being primaried, or needing the money if you're in a marginally Republican or marginally Democratic district. You really have to raise, I haven't looked at the numbers in this last cycle, but it doesn't surprise me. A contested race would be $250,000 or more. Well, that's just, that's a fundamental change and shift. So it's that issue, the power of influence groups, much, much greater, particularly those who have one issue. So the gun lobby, the lobby that's responsible. Some would say on the Democratic side, the labor lobby, the teacher lobby, or the whatever. Having raised a lot more money and having a lot more influence in elections. So the interest groups are stronger, better, in terms of more effective, more impactful. And then the last item is social media.
Yeah.
It can create a herd mentality. So if you had, in my Senate district years ago, if you had somebody that was really upset with, a vote that I'd taken or whatever, they couldn't go on Nextdoor or Twitter and have their voice. So it may be one person that is really upset that Graham Richard voted to have a mandatory helmet law. And they're just furious with me. Well, they're going to tell their friends and neighbors. They're going to tell the people at church. But now they can basically tell every voter instantaneously, immediately in my district. And not only that, they can tell every voter anywhere in the country. And that person can say, you're a terrible person. You're horrible. You're obscene because of whatever position that you took without ever hearing what your reasoning was. So you have this social media sort of mob mentality that once it gets moving, it's like a group of people, pardon my reference here, but I'm not going to apologize for it, who go to the Capitol at the request of our president and storm the Capitol.
Right.
Logic does not prevail there because you have. So that's the other factor in politics today, that something can go viral, and you can be. So it shuts down the ability for open discourse, discussion, and hey, hear my side of this. So those are the things that have changed the nature of every election, particularly state legislative elections.
Those points combined, those different factors, definitely you can see as a recipe for a lot of chaos in the political system. That I from interviewing several people now, I tend to get the same issues being brought up from people from all sides of the political spectrum. It's actually quite fascinating because time and time again, people are talking about the problem with money in politics, to a certain extent lobbying, as well as party leadership's control of dictating affairs, and of course social media as well, of sort of amplifying the political polarization. It's being consistently brought up. So it is really interesting to hear about what it was like for people who are serving in a different time compared to today.
And by the way, Ben, I don't want to sugarcoat this.
Yeah.
I'm going to be specific about something that is sensitive.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But it's all public record, Ben.
Right.
So I'm a young reform-minded candidate. I ran on a whole reform approach in terms of openness in government, open meetings, changes in the way we have an ethics code and commission. And I wrote legislation and tried to get a number campaign finance reform, get those heard. Mm-hmm. And the state senate at the time had a rules committee, and they had a leadership team that was led by Philip Gutman, a senator by the name of Gardner, and another senator, his name eludes me right now. Long story short, all of my legislative efforts were put into that rules committee and killed by the leadership. Chip Edwards was the other name I was trying to think about, I think it was. At any rate, all three of those leaders ultimately got indicted. Gutman got convicted and was sent to the Terre Haute, to the federal penitentiary, because I later was part of a group that wrote a letter of supporting him for early release. So the power of the leaders to protect their interests, and they ultimately all got, if you go back and look at that period of time, one of them resigned somewhat in disgrace, and the other one I think also might have been indicted and didn't get convicted. At any rate, there were acrimonious, hard debates around these issues that we cared about. So I'm not saying partisanship wasn't there. It was.
Right.
And a lot of party line votes. But it's gone to another level.
Yeah. That's kind of the sentiment I've heard echo over and over again. Yeah. Looking at a different subject for a minute here, just so I can get on the record. When did you get married?
We were married in 1970. That was my first marriage.
Okay, got it. And then you remarried again later, and when was that?
That was, at least I'm embarrassed.
No worries.
It's 1986.
Okay, got it.
Do you need precise dates? Or
no. Just so people can sort of get the timeline of your life and stuff.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So my first marriage ended in 1981.
Okay. And how many children do you have?
I have two children.
Okay.
I have a daughter, Heather, and she lives in the Bay Area. She lives in Sausalito. And I have three grandchildren. And then I have a son who was my current wife's birth son.
Okay.
And then I adopted him.
Sure.
His name is John.
Okay. So now, thinking back to your political career and when you first get started in the General Assembly, uh, what were you thinking when you first walked into the State House for the first time as an elected official in the General Assembly?
I was feeling a sense of kind of hope and optimism that we could do things in open government, that we could do things in all education, that we could do things in improving services back to cities and communities, environment, all the issues that I've talked to you about that I've been involved with over my life.
Yeah.
So, I was very optimistic that we could form, coalitions of progressive Republicans and Democrats. So that was it was a sense of hope and optimism.
Yeah. Okay.
Having come through, the impeachment process, and all the disruption, the opposition to the Vietnam War. I mean, if you look at the late '60s and the early '70s, very turbulent time in our history.
Yeah. Sure. And so, when it came to the legislative process, I imagine, given all your prior experience, you felt pretty comfortable with everything going on in the assembly?
Well, in addition to knowing where the bathrooms were and knowing a lot of the staff people at the Legislative Council, I also had the advantage of thinking through how and with whom I would work.
Yeah.
To get things done that needed to get done. So, for example, there was a leadership effort to create a bipartisan commission for making state government work better. I'll just call it that.
Right.
It had a fancier title. And that was, again, the workings of government. I was very interested in that. So I followed that closely and ultimately became the co-chair of a governmental reform bipartisan effort with Ned Lampkin on that, who was the majority leader from the House at the time, John Mutz and I and others. And we worked in the interim, and we came up with a package of a number of bills. And when I was talking not too long ago with my friend, former Indiana Supreme Court Justice Frank Sullivan, and Frank said, few people will know, Graham, that one of the things that you did through the chairing of that joint interim committee was to get, for the first time, legislation passed that created an administrative code. And why is that important, Ben? Prior to the work that our committee did, we call it the hip pocket regulator. If you were a state agency and you issued a regulation, you basically had that in somebody's hip pocket. Prior to computers, it was just a piece of paper somewhere in your office. There was no process by which you promulgated that regulation. So we created, in a sense, what today people would say was, and many other states already had it, federal government did, what was the administrative code. So you kept track of all the laws that were passed.
Yeah.
But where were you keeping track of all the regulations that were implementing that law?
Right.
So through a lot of work, we got that bill passed. So that you can't propose a regulation unless it's been radically changed. I don't think it has, without posting it in the Indiana Administrative Code, giving a period of time for public comment, hearings by the agency in most cases, and then you have to publish it back in that code. All this is digital now, of course, and make it available to the public. So that was one of the bills. Then we also had a very comprehensive piece of legislation people said never get passed, which was euphemistically called, or it was named, the Sunset Law.
Okay.
So we did an analysis over the course of 3 years. I mean, lots of time it took, and ended up finding that there were, I'm just using an example here, 27 different workforce development programs in 14 different agencies, and many of the agency administrators had no idea that there was another program dealing with juvenile offenders to get workforce training to get back into the working world. And so we had all these overlapping jurisdictions, and we had multiple transportation agencies. So the end result was the creation of the Government Reorganization Reform Act, which led to a systematic series over 10 years of the termination of the authority in the state of Indiana statutes.
Yeah.
And the reexamination, you had to come back and affirmatively pass the authorizing for those agencies. At the same time, we grouped them, coupled them, like we put all the transportation entities together. That ultimately got merged into a state transportation agency. Same thing was true with Health Human Services. That ultimately became, a streamlined FSSA. So over a 10-year period of time, after I left the legislature, that commission had to make recommendations for the reauthorization after all those laws were sunsetted.
Yeah, okay. Sure.
So of the things that I'm really proud of, and then we had some open meetings, open records laws that got passed that are still, I believe, active today. But it was Frank Sullivan who said people will little know and never remember that it was your work that brought this kind of government reform, consolidation, transparency, visibility, open records, and that was all done with, at differing times, one House or Senate of one party and the other of the other party.
Yeah. Sure, yeah. That's interesting. Okay. Thinking about your interactions with your constituents, how did you go about understanding the needs and wants of your constituents?
Well, every community has a tradition, and the tradition is different, but it's fairly similar in most communities. And sometimes they call it the fourth house or something. You got a snappy name for it, but it's usually this. You come back from Indianapolis. You've been busy and exhausted. It's a Saturday, and the local Chamber of Commerce hosts a gathering with the chamber members and all the legislators. And the higher up you are in leadership, the more important it is for you to be there and be featured. And I found that an interesting process. I always attended it, but it was so exclusive.
Yeah.
So if you were a neighborhood association, if you were a labor union, if you were the teachers union, you were not welcome at that. You couldn't come. So it's very exclusive. So I started holding, as a state senator, what we would now call town hall meetings, listening sessions, and I would hold them at the library. So I'd go to that one in the morning, and then sometimes throughout my Senate district, I'd have, a fire station, a library, and a church basement.
Yeah.
And, I promised everybody I'd come, a few opening comments, give you a sense of what's happening versus what you're reading in the newspapers. They always wanted prognostication, what's going to pass, what's going to fail. And then, when the snowstorms came and all the problems came, I would, this was pre-social media. Yeah. So I would also have a 800 number call-in. I would take calls. I had a lot of systems by which if you called me or sent me an email or whatever it was, I would respond within 48 hours.
Yeah, wow.
And that was and I had an intern, and I had some campaign volunteers that helped me do that. So my goal was always, rapid response.
Yeah, that's interesting. Wow.
We still got a lot of mail then, and I did the same thing.
Yeah.
I will respond to you. I shared one intern, and I think drove all of them crazy. We must respond. I want the goal to be 24 hours.
Yeah.
But you must respond to anybody who calls, anybody who emails, anybody who sends a hard copy letter. The response has to go out within 48 hours.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Wow.
And I think for 4 years, I think we were pretty close to that. We were pretty disciplined.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Now, if you signed your name on a petition and you left an address, that would take longer.
Right. Sure. Do you remember the first bill that you sponsored?
I think it was a campaign finance and open meetings and ethics.
Okay.
I think that's the first one I sponsored.
Yeah.
That's a long time ago. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the first one.
Sure.
Remember, we just come out of Watergate.
Yeah.
And the whole, hiding and, background stuff. I mean, all of that was highly visible in people's minds.
Right. Lots of interest
and
in
so
transparency.
that whole question, common cause was really getting going, and there was a whole, ethics in government, openness, disclosure, open records laws. So I'm pretty sure that my first bills included a package that had, that the common cause folks and the openness records, I know we had a lot of the journalists and news media organizations clamoring for that.
Yeah.
Kind of the Freedom of Information Act for Indiana.
Yeah, okay. What were the differences between members of the House and the Senate?
Well, we had a period of time where the Speaker of the House was a Democrat.
Okay.
And, that was a positive situation. So my first 2 years, the Senate was controlled by the Republicans.
Yeah.
And the House was controlled by the Democrats. My second 2 years, the Speaker of the House was a Republican. And the President pro tem was Senator Frank O'Bannon, who went on to become Lieutenant Governor and then Governor. So I was very close to Frank, and, I'd helped him get the votes needed to become the President pro tem. And that led to me being appointed chair of the Governmental Affairs Committee. He wanted me to be chair of the Education Committee, but I had just run for State Superintendent of Public Instruction in 1976. They were that's another story. They were desperate for a candidate. I'd been a teacher, a member of the Education Committee, and had worked hard on reforming and changing the school finance formula. So,
right,
I was recruited to be that nominee. So I ran statewide for that office. So anyway, I had visibility. I worked hard to elect Democratic state senators in '76, and we won the majority for the first time in many years, and the last time since today. I mean, had I been there at any other probably time, I would never have had the opportunity to chair a committee, be a key member of the Appropriations Subcommittee, the Finance Committee, and was on the Natural Resources Committee. And so by chairing governmental affairs, that gave me an opportunity to do the governmental reform work that I just described to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the leaders, I worked across the aisle during the time that John Mutz was not in leadership.
Okay.
Because, Frank O'Bannon was. So, it was a period of time where Morris Mills was one of the most powerful senators in the state because he was chair of the Finance Committee, and then for 2 years he wasn't. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, your question was who is in the leadership. I'm trying to think of I just lost his name, the speaker from 74 to 76 was from Lake County. And then Kermit Burrows was the speaker after that.
Right.
And then, as I said, Phil Gutman. And then after that, it was Frank O'Bannon in the Senate. So after the 76 election, so for 77, 78, the Democrats had leadership of the Senate.
Right, okay. Got it. And so when the Democrats didn't have leadership, especially, how did you garner support for your legislation? How often did you have to work across the aisle?
Well, as I say, extensively, because you're not a successful legislator if your bill passes the House but can't pass the Senate, or the Senate, not the House.
Yeah.
So I understood that from being an intern and campaigning for the legislature. So from day one, I did something that some people think about doing but don't actually execute on, and I called it, take a legislator to lunch.
Okay.
Or breakfast. So I made a point of having a breakfast with anybody that would, or lunch, one-on-one,
Mm-hmm.
who was, and this happened over a period of years, a Democratic senator, a Republican senator, a Democratic House member, a Republican House member. I attended all the events that were gatherings where, there's always 4 or 5 receptions every night. Back in that time, particularly, lavish receptions from every trade association that ever existed. So, you go to the chiropractors, the funeral directors, the volunteer firefighters, whatever it is that night. And I would make a point of going up and introducing myself. I take that little book with the photos of the House members.
Yeah.
And I memorize it. The Senate wasn't that hard because you're there. You know the
Right.
Democrats. There are only 50 of them. And so I would make a point of introducing myself and trying to ask them questions, be attentive, listen. And then if there was some interest, say, well, I'd love to catch lunch with you sometime. So I was doing that purposely to build trust with key legislators.
Wow.
And then for my counterparts, so for the House Governmental Affairs Committee counterpart, we had summertime joint governmental affairs. This is our whole reform for, and I was chairing that. And there were independent members and, like I mentioned, we had key members from the House and the Senate on part of that government reform commission. And then that gave you a chance away from the legislature to have a meeting that might maybe go 2 hours, 3 hours. And then, so for example, Dr. Ned Lampkin,
Yeah.
wonderful human being, and he and his wife Martha, he was the majority leader when Kermit Burrows was the speaker. And he was also appointed to be on this, he also was interested in government reform. So we have to be respectful, I think, trusted friends.
Yeah.
And when the legislation was starting to get hung up in the House, he was instrumental in keeping it moving. Because the Democrats didn't control the House.
Right.
So that's what, this all then comes down to leadership. And you can choose to be a collaborative leader, a consensus leader, a cooperative leader, or Or, and I'll use my favorite example now, which is a leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, who just brazenly says, we're going to do everything we can to stop Barack Obama from getting any credit.
Right.
We're gonna just attack and undermine Obamacare. And he's doing the same plain book. He's basically told people, my agenda is to get back in the majority, and I do that by making sure that Joe Biden doesn't get his bills passed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you can choose to be that kind of leader, and we have them on the Democratic side. I'm not, but
right.
But back then, I would say it was leadership. There was a group of us who said it's better that we get these things done than just beat each other up so I can win the next election.
Right. There's a lot more people, I guess, in the past that were willing to work together for sort of a common interest of just trying to make government run more efficiently versus more so today it's more of a power struggle. Yeah, wow. So did you have a pretty good sense of how people would vote prior to actually voting?
Well, I'll tell you another story.
Yeah.
That I think it came from King Tully. I can't remember, but it was a Republican. In that first couple of months when I was looked like a college student, and yet I was in the Senate. I asked a question, and I said, so why do you respect a senator in your caucus, and why do you respect a senator that's in the Democratic caucus? And he said, look, I'm going to give you some advice. Never go to that microphone without asking yourself these three questions first. One, will my speaking on this persuade anybody out there to change their vote or vote my way? Two, has it already been said before? And three, can I say it in a way that will command attention and people will actually listen?
Yeah.
If you can't do that, then don't go up there. Because when you do go up there, people will stop what they're doing and they'll listen because you aren't, you're not the traditional orator. And then in a separate conversation, we were talking about that first question, will my speaking out change any votes? And he said, you still have senators who have been here a long time, and they've never learned the first rule. Learn to distinguish the difference between a compliment and a commitment.
Yeah.
You will get all kinds of people that will compliment you on your bill and so forth. That's not a commitment. And you have to learn to distinguish, and then you have to learn when is it really a compliment? When is it really a commitment? Well, how do I know? And he said there'll be some senators that their word is their bond. There'll be others that you'll only know it's a commitment when they've publicly said it or when a lobbying group lists them as a supporter or an opponent of the bill they care about.
Yeah.
As a public demonstration. And every senator is different, but you have to learn that skill. You have to learn to it's the old Tip O'Neill, you don't have to have a calculator, but you better have a head to count the commitments. You got to know who's for you and who's against you.
Sure. Let's see. What would you say the public does not know about the Indiana General Assembly and how it operates?
That it's really difficult today to be a profile and courage senator because of the need for reform of the campaign finance system. Money rules.
Yeah.
Campaign contributions rule. The average voter does not realize the power of the pay and play system. It needs reform.
Yeah. You talked a little bit earlier about how you basically were starting a family when you first got elected. How did your legislative service affect your family life?
Well, I think it was ultimately not healthy, and it was less legislative service, although you are away for some time from your family, even though it's 2.5 to 3 hours by car, depending upon the weather, from Fort Wayne to the State House. For me, what was detrimental to my first marriage was being personally and professionally consumed in perpetual campaigning.
Okay.
So I was a candidate in 70. I managed a campaign locally in 71. Lost the campaign in 72. Got elected to the state senate in 74. Was the Democratic nominee for state superintendent in 76. And then, instead of seeking re-election in 78, I ran statewide for the nomination for lieutenant governor. So it was ambition and the consuming of being involved in politics, all pretty much before the age of 30.
Yeah, it makes sense. What would you say was the most controversial legislative issue during your time in the General Assembly?
Well, the one that was the highest and most visible was the legalization, the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. I think we were the last state up until Virginia and it won by one vote in the Senate for the Indiana vote to authorize it. A couple of others that kind of are. Yes, you always had tremendous interest in bills that affected the labor, the labor laws and the collective bargaining rights, and those sorts of issues, because there could be a large rallying of a significant number of people. But some that were localized that got a tremendous amount of heat and visibility. I remember Joe Brugenschmidt was the chair of the Senate Natural Resources Committee at that time, which had environment, didn't have any energy issues. Those were in another committee. But the land acquisition strategies and approach around the Hoosier National Forest and other federally controlled forest lands had gotten so challenging because there were some townships and even whole counties that were losing their tax base as property would become available. There was an agreement with the federal government that they had the right to buy that property and exclude other private owners from being in that process. So that whole, it was characterized as eminent domain. It had an element of eminent domain to it, but it wasn't really pure eminent domain. We had intense debates. That surprised me more than anything. The name calling, the fist shaking, and large contingent of people coming in to protest that. So that's an example of an issue that got very hot, over and above, the big issues of financing for public education and Some of I know one piece of reform legislation that has been coming around forever was the abolishing local township trustees and local township allowing that to take place by a county vote to streamline local government. And, a lot of people really want to keep their township system of government, and particularly those that are the office holders, that are assessors and trustees. So that would always be a big issue.
Yeah, sure. Now, you mentioned the Equal Rights Amendment. To what role did you have in the Equal Rights Amendment and the debates going on?
Well, I was very strongly in favor of, and came out early and strong, saying I would vote for the Equal Rights Amendment. But I remember this vividly. There was a tall, lanky lawyer, senator from Bloomington, Senator Pat Carroll, and he had his own law practice, and there was a shorter, Gilliam Hill, hairy kind of Democrat, Eldon Tipton, from the Terre Haute area. And the two of them fought over a lot of things. But Eldon had, unlike Pat and I had committed on all the surveys and all the, women's rights advocacy groups that we were going to vote for. So we were kind of left alone because we were not persuadable to change the vote by the Phyllis Schlafly and other folks. But Eldon told one group during a campaign that he was for the Equal Rights Amendment, and they told another group they won't vote for it. So this ultimately passed by one vote.
Yeah.
And I think even New York Times, others were calling, and instead of interviewing Pat Carroll or Graham Richard, who have been ardent advocates, they always went to Mr. One Vote, who claimed that, he was the reason.
Yeah.
He was the reason that the Equal Rights Amendment passed. So he got invited to the NOW conference and was celebrated as this hero from Indiana.
Yeah.
Even though he was on the fence and had told both parties up until the vote.
That's funny.
That he was firm. And Eldon will have a different story, but he and Pat were both in the same caucus, when one or the other would start to speak, the other would leave the caucus. It got that bad.
Wow. And
they just couldn't tolerate to hear each other.
Yeah, so that's interesting. What would you say were the main arguments on each side for or against the Equal Rights Amendment during your time?
Well, I think the arguments for it have been pretty consistent, and Birchby was the author of that amendment, and it's like, why shouldn't women have the same rights that men have?
Yeah.
Voting rights, owning property rights. Back then, there were many states and policies that a woman couldn't get her own credit card. It had to be in her husband's name.
Wow.
She couldn't have her own credit. She couldn't borrow. She couldn't buy a house. She couldn't, depending on where you were. Now, those were imposed sometimes by the financial institutions, sometimes by laws, by custom, by tradition, practice. One of the reasons Phyllis Schlafly and her whole Eagle Forum is they began to get women to turn against it because they said, you have this and you're going to lose your entitlements to the pensions. Your husband dies and you're not going to get his pension anymore because equal rights, that.
Yeah.
So tremendous misinformation, just outright disinformation.
Okay.
About what the law would do, and that got a lot of people scared. And they were saying, I don't know, I don't want that. And so, we would say equal pay, equal work, and they would say, this happens, and you may not be able to get that job because they can't afford to pay you that. So there'll be no job there for you at all.
Okay.
So all of it. So those were. I mean, I'm boiling those down to bumper strips, but it was that kind of discussion.
Right. Yeah, I understand.
I mean, there's a whole other dimension to it which you can read about, which is, God did not choose you. Follow the commandments. Be obedient. I mean, it's the same thing that many officiants at weddings that are fundamentalist Christian weddings. It's like, be obedient. That was the word, obedient. So equal rights. Look, you're supposed to do what your husband says.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. What would you say was the biggest hurdle you had to overcome during your time in office?
Persuading skeptical people, not cynics, because cynics don't usually change their mind.
Yeah.
To embrace a change, a new law, and probably both the public, but also other legislators.
Yeah. Okay.
It's hard for somebody to change something that's been heavily benefiting them.
Right. What, in your opinion, is the most important work of the Indiana General Assembly?
I think it is in the budget and in major legislation that affects the health, the safety, the welfare, the economic growth of the state. It's setting forward in the law the kind of direction that's important for the state.
Right.
In those major issues. And so the law becomes the embodiment of what your leadership values.
Yeah. Sure.
And so to me, it's trying to move our state in a direction for health and well-being and safety and education. If you look at the biggest dollars that are being spent, and that's why I say the budget. The budget is you're in when you sit down in your household for the given month or the given year, and you allocate your dollars. If you decide you're going to spend it on a vacation, if you decide you're going to prioritize saving up money for college education, if you decide you're going to start a new business or you're getting ready to buy a home, you've set the priorities for your household by that budget.
Yeah.
And so in Indiana, there's a massive amount of money that goes to education at all levels. There's a massive amount of money that goes to what we would call the human service, social service, retirement benefits, our Medicare, our Medicaid commitment, all of that. So you're really setting the direction for the state by those policies.
Right.
So that's what I think is really important.
Yeah. Okay. All right, we're down to the last handful of questions here. Why did you leave the Indiana General Assembly? What exactly happened?
I knew that I could not run for statewide office and be a good senator.
Okay.
Some people do that. I couldn't. I went through that in a shortened version in 1976 when I really only started campaigning just before the convention, had a short summertime campaign season into the fall. But having done that, if I was going to pursue higher elected office, I really had to do it 100% full time, and I didn't think it was fair to my constituents. So I began doing some of that in 78 and some in 79, but it really got going in 79. So, the 78 campaign for re-election would be different because it's kind of congruent to your existing Senate work. But I would be going all over the state.
Sure.
So that's why I did. And then that gave me time to campaign full time in 79 and 80. Second reason, I enjoyed the convening and being a committee chair. Yeah, I'll give an example. There was an issue that had been around for a long time, and it was the territorial disputes over the rural electric cooperatives, the investor-owned utilities, and the municipal electric utilities. And whenever there was an annexation of a city by other property, the question was who would serve and what were the boundaries. And this has been a battle for, 2 decades. So I was the chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction. And along with my counterpart in the House, we got together and said, look, let's get everybody who has a stake in this in the room, about 10 people, and say to them, we're the committee chairs of jurisdiction in the Senate and the House, and if you don't come up with a system once and for all for resolving this, the two of us will get a bill and we'll get it passed, and we're not sure any of you will be happy. So,
okay. Yeah.
get it done. Well, people said that could never happen, and we did it.
Wow.
So that's leadership. And there are many times, and as a committee chairman, you still have to always use persuasion, but you do have some power. I knew that the Democrats were not likely to win and keep control of the Senate, and I didn't want to be a minority legislator.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So how would you summarize your time as a state legislator overall then?
It was a magnificent learning experience because you could be reading information, debating on multi-billion-dollar school finance formula, legalization of Laetrile, fire code safety requirements, community development and housing, the legalization or the authorization of recombinant DNA research. You can be doing all that in one day.
Yeah.
So as a young person, I learned more about banking. I learned more about finance. I learned more about insurance, about medical malpractice insurance, and all this stuff. I would never have learned that. So for a guy that loves learning,
yeah,
if a young person comes to me and says, I'm thinking about running for the legislature, I always urge them, if there's a decent shot at winning, to do it, because you will learn so much so fast.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So for me, I'm a lifelong learner. That was part of my most important laboratory for lifelong learning. I made relationships that I have to this day. Republicans, Democrats. I learned the functional part of government at the township level, the legislative level, city government level. All that came from that time. And I look at the whole experience, not just the 4 years I was a state senator. Because you learn while you're campaigning. You learn while you're an intern. You learn while you're an assistant in the superintendent's office about the whole educational system.
Yeah.
I was asked. I would not have been asked to co-chair a very valuable commission for me by Evan Bly, and then Frank O'Bannon, and then Joe Kernan, which was the state's what at that time was called Human Resource Investment Commission, our workforce board. So by chairing that, we had all the agency heads for over, more than a decade. I think it was almost 12 years, where I was listening and learning about welfare to work, new workforce programs, economic development trends, all of that through. And then I was appointed to numerous boards and commissions. I helped to start new business ventures. It was funded by some funding, and all those connections and relationships before I ran for mayor of Fort Wayne came from, knowing Frank Abandon, knowing people that I worked with, and they said, "Oh, Graham," in fact, I was asked by Evan Bay's folks to become the first executive director of the very first lottery. I turned that down because I was, I didn't have the time to take a full-time job in Indianapolis at the time that was offered to me.
Sure.
But my point is this: it's. So what did I learn? That was the foundational building block for many of the private sector. So I was an investor in Mohead Hydro and cogeneration. I'm now an investor in all kinds of clean energy technologies because I understood federal public policy, how it affected state public policy as it relates to clean energy. I understood what the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commissions did, whose jurisdiction was, and what PURPA meant, and all. So it was, again, this laboratory of learning that opened many, many more opportunities for more learning.
Yeah.
And I was a much, much better mayor of Fort Wayne, Indiana, because I understood the inner workings of state government. I knew which lobbyists to hire. I knew what to go after, how to work with the Republican committee chairs in the House and the Senate. I understood how to leverage public and private funds to get things done in Fort Wayne. I was a co-sponsor way back when in what was called, with Senator Bob Kovach of Mishawaka at the time and others, which was called tax incremental financing. We had one of the first programs in the country that was critical for economic development, incentives, and strategy ever since we got that passed in 78.
Yeah. Wow. Now, did you have any regrets as a legislator?
Well, you do. There are times when I think I might have been able to be more persuasive by being less, being a better listener.
Okay.
And understanding what's behind an emotion or a comment from a legislator.
Yeah.
And then accommodating that, compromising, hearing and incorporating that to get a bill done better, faster. I was not a terrible listener, but I've always been a talker. And I've sometimes gotten the reputation of trying to sound like I'm the smartest guy in the room, and I think that's a fair criticism. So I have a regret that I didn't mature a little faster in understanding that getting a good outcome, getting a well-formed outcome is much more important than making your point and having people believe that you're smart.
Yeah, sure.
Many of us in politics suffer from that arrogance.
Right. So what advice would you give to future legislators or even current legislators?
Seek first to understand and listen. What is it that really is behind the emotion and the motivation of somebody who is a skeptic about your legislation? Ignore the cynics because you're not going to convince them. And then the other is treat every learning experience as not an end, but part of a process. So, for example, I never gave up on a legislator who said, I hate that bill. I'm going to do everything I can to beat it, Graham. I never personalized that. I learned to get up, it took me a while, to get up kind of as though you were on a balcony and looking down on yourself and others. And you're able to get some detachment okay, I understand you're not with me on this bill.
Right.
But on the next bill, I want you to know that there's goodwill on my part, and let's talk about our differences on the next bill, and maybe we'll be together. That is hard to do when people exchange bitter, nasty words and put things on Twitter and say them out to the world. Really hard to do. But we need that more than anything, because the person who's against you on one bill may be for you on the next bill.
Yeah, I understand.
So that's my advice. Try not to personalize it. Try not to personalize it.
Let's see, last couple questions here. What, if any, enduring qualities do Hoosiers still have or hold dear?
Would you repeat that again? I could not hear it.
Yeah. What, if any, enduring qualities do Hoosiers still have or hold dear?
Well, I think it's hard to generalize. I think Hoosiers are a wide range of people. We talked about that earlier. I mean, you can have a person of the same political party. Let's take, say, Bill Ruckelshaus versus Mike Pence. They're both Republicans.
Yeah.
And they come from different eras, and they have different beliefs, and they exercise those political beliefs differently. So what I would say is this. I think that most of the people that I know on whatever political perspective value trust. They value authenticity. They value, even if they don't agree with you at all, your willingness to be respectful of the character of another person, even if you really, really disagree with them on a fundamental level.
Yeah.
So I think those are values. As a mayor, I worked very closely with my Republican colleagues, and after being a mayor, with the Republican Mayor Greg Ballard of Indianapolis. So you find the common ground, and you work from there. And helping a single mom post-COVID who's got 3 kids and 2 low-paying jobs and is absolutely struggling to pay her utility bill and her rent should not be viewed as partisan.
Right.
We got to find a way to reduce the energy burden and to help that person, build some assets and resources and, move up the economic ladder. I really, when I talk to my very conservative Republican, it's the question of how you do that we have a disagreement over. Well, let's find a place where there's some common ground.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. I think the vast majority of people that I know over my life respect, find some common ground, try not to personalize it, try not to demonize it, try not to say, you're a horrible person because you believe that.
Right. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Last question. What do you want Hoosiers to know about their role in relation to the function of the Indiana General Assembly?
Well, number one, it is a very important office, and state legislators are some of the most accessible public officials you have. So what I want them to know is, don't be afraid to call up, old-fashioned, call up, go to a meeting, organize a meeting with a legislator, and just have a brown bag lunch, a coffee, once we're out of COVID, a coffee klatch, organize an online gathering if you need to with your neighborhood association, your church group, your social group.
Yeah.
Get to know your legislator.
Yeah.
Tell them what you care about. Keep the channels of communication and trust building going. It's so simple. Oh, I would make presentations to business leaders in Fort Wayne, and I would say, this is before and after I was I'd say, what's the name of your state representative? What's the name of your state senator? When's the last time you communicated in some direct way with that person?
Right.
Why not? Why haven't you done that? It's a low lift. Doesn't take much. Thank you so much, Ben. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate.
Look forward to hearing more about your history.
Yeah.
When it's ready, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to take part in the project. It should be a great addition. You had so many interesting things to say. So thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you, Ben. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.